Good day, everybody. Zack with RevZilla here, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider, where we learn about motorcycles as we ride. I am super excited about today's guest because it's from another era, one of loud paint, loud pipes, and smoking, you might say. That's right, that is a 1985 Yamaha RZ350 parallel twin two-stroke, about 50 horsepower, and when it was new, 2,400 American dollars. If you're anything like me, you'd take that right about now, yeah? Anyway, let's step into the time machine and see what this sucker's like on the daily ride. All right, everybody, here it is. RZ350, or if you're Canadian, the old RZ350, eh? Yeah. Anyway, Kenny Roberts' signature on the fairing. Of course, that adds legitimacy to any motorcycle. Dual rotors. We'll talk a little bit about the brakes as we use them. These big old expansion chambers underneath, of course, a trademark of the two-stroke engine. Not stock pipes, because basically no RZ350 has stock pipes as far as I can tell. Basically everyone changed them because the stock ones were really choked the bike up. Early emission stuff. Anywho, here's the engine, 347cc parallel twin two-stroke YPVS. That is Yamaha power valve system. So we'll talk about that. It's a way to make the engine run a little bit better at 2 different RPMs. But yeah, stone simple, right? Look at that. You can just see everything. It's all right here. It's remarkable. And nice sort of flat seat, lovely paint job. Yeah, let's fire it up, right? No electric start. Gotta kick this mamma jamma. Old school. Yeah. Totally wicked, right? Let's hit the road, shall we? I can't tell you how excited I am. Alrighty, here we are, trucking along our first little stint on the old RZ350. I know that specs are probably a little bit less important to you, maybe, I don't know, with an old bike than they would be with a new bike, but I'll run through some of them anyway. You got about 370 pounds. It's a pretty light bike. I mean, it's a small displacement, but also two strokes are sort of famously light. Like I said, about 50 horsepower. I think the dyno that I looked up said it was 52 horsepower when they dynoed it in 1984 or 85, something like that. That probably would have been with stock pipes on, and probably make a little bit more power now, but then again, it's old. I don't know, whatever. The point is, that's the approximate horsepower. What's really exciting about it is how it feels, not so much the actual number. And we'll, of course, talk about that as well. Other specs is a 31.5-inch seat height, I believe. I don't know, some people told me in my research it was a little tall for the era, but it doesn't feel particularly big to me. Yeah, like I said, 2,400 bucks, brand new in 1984, I believe. But now they probably sell for maybe 7,000, 8,000, 7,500 bucks. I think that was the last sale price I saw for one. And last of all, the important specification that I'd like to share before I forget is the fuel capacity, which you're probably thinking, oh, a little 350 from the 80s, probably got a little tiny tank. It's actually a 5.2 gallon gas tank, which I find, I don't know, maybe fascinating is not the right word, but surprising, I suppose. Whoa, hey! Gotta test the brakes a little early. Anyhow, there's a basic rundown for you of specifications on RZ350. There we go. A little power, really? Holy smokes. About to fire out onto the freeway here, which was one of my big questions about this bike, was what it was like to ride on the freeway. So here we go, emerging. Certainly has enough power to go down the freeway, that's for sure. All right, there we go. Into overdrive, 6th gear, about 70 miles an hour, something like that. We're cruising along at 6,500 RPM, something like that. I guess 6,500, 75 miles an hour. Anyway, and it's surprisingly relaxed and comfortable, I would say. The seat is a little bit narrow and kind of stiff. I don't know if the foam's original, so that might have something to do with it, but in general, the riding position's not too bad. The pegs feel pretty high, and one thing that's very common with riding old bikes is that basically the tank feels long. I'm not going to look down. I'm going to point the camera down if you can see it. It's very long. If you think about how far it is from the front of the seat to the headstock on an MT-07 or something like that, I don't know, it feels significantly shorter. This feels like kind of a long reach from the seat to the bars, which is fine for me because I'm tall, but does feel a little bit antiquated, which I suppose isn't that surprising. But yeah, otherwise, geez, it's pretty nice. I don't know. Not a lot of wind protection. Basically just getting anywhere from my sternum up is all getting wind blast on it. My shoulders, my head, of course. So I don't know. It's not particularly comfortable, but I don't know. I guess it's better than I was expecting. Riding position feels weird when you lean it over. Feels like I'm sitting on top of the rear tire and the bars are way out in front of me. So yeah, we don't often talk about really specific stuff about engine design on Daily Rider, but the Yamaha power valve system on this bike is pretty interesting. It's basically variable valve timing for two-strokes, essentially. I was talking to a buddy of mine who's had one of these since high school, when he was in high school in the early 90s, and yeah, he explained it basically as, you know, Honda VTEC or Ducati DVT, except for two-strokes. And that's essentially what it is, because when you change where the ports are on a two-stroke engine, you change essentially when the gases are released and compressed in the combustion chamber. So you essentially change the valve timing of the engine. So that's what this power valve does. At 7,000 RPM, this little dial in there swivels on a servo motor, and it allows better airflow through the engine at the high end of the rev range. And then below 7,000, that little guy spins the other way and restricts some of the airflow that you'd get at high RPM. So it's pretty nifty technology. It's sort of the stuff they started using in two-strokes in the late 70s, I think. So by the mid-80s, it was something they could apply to a street bike for sure. And yeah, you'll notice as we accelerate throughout this episode, as I get up above 7,000 is where it really kind of starts to scream, really kind of packs a punch. It's pretty cool. When I was doing my research on this bike, I had a friend of mine tell me that the engine is rubber mounted, which is something I didn't really realize, because the only two-strokes that I really spent a lot of time on were essentially race bikes. They were either dirt bikes or road racing bikes, but they weren't designed for the street. And so the rubber mounted engine just takes a lot of the vibes out of the perimeter frame, and therefore your hands and feet and butt where you contact the motorcycle. So, you know, now that I'm cruising along here and it feels pretty comfortable, I guess that kind of snaps into focus. That whole rubber mounted engine thing makes sense. This is usually where we talk about mirrors. These ones aren't bad. They're surprisingly smooth, although they're not placed in a particularly good spot for someone my size. I basically am getting a lot of elbow. That's entirely possible that 1985 was a little too soon, especially for a bike like this, for companies to have really specific goals in mind for ergonomics and mirror sight lines and that kind of thing. All right, time to trundle through the neighborhood here and see what this bike's low speed manners are like. And spoiler alert, they're not that great. Balance is pretty good. Oh geez, you definitely got to be a little cautious with the clutch. It's not exactly designed for parking lot maneuvers, this bike. The clutch is a little bit grabby, but you know, it's an old dog. Give it a little bit of a pass, I suppose. See if we can get this stop sign. Nope. That's one thing about two-strokes, they don't really like to be lugged, you know? I'm the type of rider that usually rides bikes that basically as low in RPM as the engine seems happy. And that's definitely the case with this bike too. The engine's just not very happy below, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 RPM in general. Here we go. Yeah, we got a clean stop that time. Yeah. Yeah, the fueling is surprisingly good. I mean, two-strokes are notoriously kind of fickle and finicky when it comes to tuning and mixture and that kind of thing. But the fueling on this bike is surprisingly good, especially considering it's vintage. It just works pretty well. When it zips up past 6,500 there, it really comes alive. It's pretty fun. And you know, one more thing about that Yamaha power valve thing, it's interesting to me that it's so seamless. It's really, you can't feel anything. Oh, I stalled it. That's my bad. I'm just gonna have to be a little bit strategic at this stoplight here. It's the perfect timing for the stoplight. Just got to kick it back to life here. There we go. Anyway, the power valve thing, I find it really interesting that it's so smooth, because I mean, Ducati's DVT system is pretty smooth in this day and age. What's up? All right, Super Duke, commuter Super Duke, respect. Anyway, the DVT system is pretty smooth in this day and age. I remember that Honda VFR 800, that sort of rebirth that they did in 2014 or something, maybe. Oh, he wants to talk to me. What's that?
That's an RZ350.
Yeah, it sure is. Nice bike yourself. Yeah. He's got respect. The guy in the Super Duke's got respect. That says something for the RZ350. He's got big respect. His eyes are wide, man. He's loving it. Anyway, where I was going with that point, it was not terribly interesting. The point is that VFR that came out in 2014 there, it was really obvious when the valves would change. You know, granted, four-stroke valve systems are a lot more complicated. But, you know, you could hear it in the engine. You could hear this little shafts moving around, and it would sort of clank, and the engine character would change. And, I don't know, considering two-strokes are sort of famous for having sort of difficult to manage power bands, I'm pretty impressed with this engine in general. This is where I always talk about passenger accommodations, often behind a Lexus. I don't know what this street's called, but I hope it's called Lover's Lane, because this is where I always talk about my wife and how I put her on the back of motorcycles and ask for her opinion. I didn't have a chance to do that on this bike, and I apologize. But what I can tell you about the passenger accommodations is that the seat's pretty flat, and the ergonomics will be pretty similar in the lower body as they are for the rider, which is to say, maybe a little tight if you're tall, but in general, pretty reasonable. Passenger riding this bike is going to be very similar to a rider riding this bike, in so much as it might not be the best way to get from point A to point B, but you're gonna soak in the senses. You know, you're gonna get the sounds and the smells of riding a two-stroke. So hopefully your passenger enjoys that, I guess is all I have to say. It's a pretty big wheelie. It actually brings me to an interesting point about passengers, come to think of it. If you put a passenger on this bike, that's a situation in which you could get yourself in a little bit of trouble if you weren't ready for that you know, power valve to open and the bike to kind of shoot forward like that. You could loop the thing, and a passenger would help. So, I mean, you know, that is to say, a passenger would help make the front wheel light, which could hurt you and the passenger. So keep that in mind, maybe. All right, getting a nice little run at this twisty roads. These tar snakes, not super fun. Oh, what a delightful little machine. Outstanding. This is great. I mean, I'm having a blast, but I will say, it doesn't handle great, if I'm honest. It feels like the front end is pretty far away from my body. And it also, if you hit bumps in the middle of a corner, it kind of like shimmies and shakes a little bit. I know aftermarket steering dampers were definitely a popular modification on this bike. Yeah, it was definitely, this bike is from an era when, you know, machines were still sometimes focused on making horsepower or looking cool a lot more than they were focused on balance and, I don't know, accountability, you might say. It's a real treat to ride, but it's definitely anachronistic, especially when it comes to the chassis. I haven't really talked about the dash yet, but I will say I just love the instrumentation. It's so fighter pilot. It's rad. I mean, the tack right in the middle is just so purposeful, and yeah, I don't know, the speedo with the multicolors, it's got kph and miles an hour on there. I don't know, it's just, and all these like little freaking Star Wars looking lights for the signals and the high beam and stuff. These like weak incandescent bulbs in there behind this thick, almost opaque plastic, it looks like. I don't know, it's like, feels like being in a spaceship that was designed in the 70s or something. It's awesome. And the temp gauge is nice and big. You'll notice that over here. This is you know, coolant temperature, and they used a lot of dash space to show that, because that's pretty important. Liquid cooling a two-stroke is a big deal. That was a huge stride for two-strokes, because they do get really hot when they run well, and when they don't run well, they can run even hotter sometimes. So something that they figured the rider would want to have their eye on. There we go. Oh my god, it's like eating a baguette in Paris, or I don't know, a cannoli in Milan, and so on and so forth. A slice of New York pizza. It just feels right. I mean, accelerating on a two-stroke is like you're going to its happy place. You're experiencing the engine in the place that it just only ever wants to live, and the sound is just it's intoxicating. All right, red light. We can talk about these brakes. Pause on a little bit. They're really not bad. I mean, there's a surprising amount of power. I would assume vintage brakes like this to be quite a bit worse, but someone on Instagram did ask, you know, like, oh, dual rotors on an old 350cc bike like that, is that kind of overkill? And what I can tell you is no, it's not overkill. First of all, because the bike's pretty fast. I mean, it's not actually fast, but it's sort of like surprisingly fast, or surprising in how fast it is, if that makes sense. But anyway, the brakes are they're not overkill for a couple reasons, but the big one is that, yeah, it's, you know, dual rotors and they look kind of beefy, but it's not the same dual rotors you get today. You know, it's like, these aren't the same brakes you get on a Kawasaki Z900, or I don't know, even just brakes nowadays that are not very good are probably be better than these, because the technology is just a little bit better. So I definitely appreciate having the dual rotors. I don't think I'd want to ride this bike if it didn't have that. You see, you can spin past redline. That's another two-stroke thing. I just love it. So good. Like, it has red line at 9,500, but like you can go way past that. Not going to float any valves. No intake valves, no exhaust valves, no camshafts, no push rods, nothing. Just air getting forced around and exploded. Ugh, I'm having a great time, everybody. I hope you are too. I can try and crank over and let you guys get a better look at this dash. Can you see that? Is that a little better? It's just delightful. This sort of like old textured plastic, you know, it does look a little bit antique and worn out, but I don't know, I love the simplicity of it. It's awesome. It's even got like little like crosshairs, kind of. You see that? It's got, you know, a vertical line and a horizontal line in the tack and in the speedo and in here. It's all just very aviation. It's rad. You know, it's worth comparing this bike to, you know, a modern 300 class engine, I suppose. You know, it is much faster than, you know, a Ninja 400 or an R3 or MT-03, whatever, same, you know, kind of thing. And that's because of the nature of a two-stroke, right? It's firing once every 2 strokes instead of once every 4. So theoretically, you get twice as much power at the same displacement. Not actually true in practice, but yeah, you do get a lot more power from an engine like this, and just the dynamic is so much different, you know, where those engines are designed to be kind of under stressed and you know, rev happy, but able to trundle along and get good mileage and be compact and reasonable, and while being fun. This one's a little bit more purposeful, you might say. But yeah, the big difference with this bike compared to, say, an MT-03, I would say, is the ergonomics and chassis. You know, just the brakes and the suspension and stuff. It's newer, right? And it's also a little more balanced. And you know, the MT-03 riding position feels a lot more contemporary and neutral and compact. This feels kind of yeah, it just feels a little bit antiquated, because it is. You know, my feet feel like they're pretty far forward, and my butt feels low, and the tank feels long. The controls feel kind of far away. The front end feels far away. I don't feel like I'm over the front of the bike like you're on a new bike. But yeah, I don't know, just some food for thought in case you were wondering. Something I'd like to talk a little bit about is history of this bike and sort of where it fits into motorcycling history. And I don't have all the answers. There are a lot of people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am about motorcycling in general, but specifically, you know, RZs and Yamaha 2-strokes. But just really broadly, you know, this was the end of the era. This was kind of the end of the line for 2-strokes. It was 1985. They imported these bikes, 84 and 85, I think, for the RZ350. There was also the, was it RD350 LC, which was an RD, which had historically been air-cooled, but it was LC because it was liquid-cooled. And before that, there was a whole slew of Japanese 2-strokes that really took the world by storm and sort of arguably, you know, drove British bikes underground. And I don't know, I guess those were Japanese bikes in general. But yeah, this is the end of a pretty important era in motorcycling and sort of 2-stroke street bikes. It wasn't literally the last one, I don't think. I don't know, maybe it was. But if not, it's sort of a cornerstone of the end of the era. Because 1986 was when the first GSX-R 750 hit, and that was a real watershed moment for motorcycling. You know, like that bike changed the sort of outlook of sport bikes forever. And you know, 84, 82, 84, gosh, now I forget, that was the first Kawasaki Ninja. So the world was shifting then, and these bikes were dying essentially. But I think in a lot of ways that's what makes it feel kind of special. And this is where we'd normally come out for our dirt ride, but I did not take this guy in the dirt because, you know, it's not mine. It could be in a museum as far as I'm concerned. It's arguably rude enough for me to wheelie it around, so we didn't take it down the dirt. Sorry everybody who wanted to know how an RZ350 goes over a jump, but back to the point I was making, it's too special. And I think that's one of the reasons this bike is really cool. It might not be the utmost or the absolute pinnacle best 2-stroke street bike that ever existed, but because it is a lightning rod for the end of the era, I think it feels important and special. My buddy who's had one for 30 years now pointed out that, you know, Top Gun came out in 1986, right? And Tom Cruise was riding a Ninja, and, you know, culturally, then like everyone just wanted a Ninja, right? And when you look at this dash, you're like, this is a Top Gun dash, man. This is like an 80s fighter pilot setup. So what if Top Gun had come out in 1984, 85, and he had been riding an RZ350? I don't know. Would that have changed the course of history? Probably not. I don't know. I'm just saying it was an interesting time. Anyway, I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm going to start reading tarot cards here pretty soon. The point is, I just think this bike is awesome, and I hope you've had fun riding along on it. I've had a blast. I think it's so fun, and I hope the lovely owner, Christina, lets me ride it again sometime. It's so cool. Now this is historically where we talk about competitors and price and kind of wrap up the episode. I guess maybe I did that a little bit early. I said before that You know, I saw one of these go up for auction, or sold at auction, excuse me, for 7,500 bucks, I think, which, I don't know, feels like kind of a steal. It's a really cool bike, and you know, granted, yeah, it's kind of a Sunday rider, you know. I mean, you could daily this thing, but I don't know how smart that would be. You know, you'd rack up miles, and you'd also just, I don't know, say a little harder to find parts and stuff like that. And of course, with an old bike, you're always a little bit more likely to get stranded. I mean, this thing isn't famous for massive failures or anything like that, but it's an old bike, and I don't know. If I had one of these, I definitely want to have something to ride around on the reg, and then take this out when I was in a special kind of mood, I suppose. Okay, now just time to... Oh, weird. An accident right there? Jason. All right, down the freeway we go. Back home, and we'll rank this sucker. Peeling off the freeway. Awesome. I mean, you can see how you'd feel like Kenny Roberts exiting the freeway in 1985. Can you back it in? Not really. I'm not gonna lean into that too hard. I'm not trying to chuck this thing on the ground. You probably could if you really tried, but I mean, come on. We don't need to go down that road, do we? Oh, look at that. It's got a center stand. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's definitely old school, agreed? Now that it's warmed up, we can give it a little rev. I mean, oh man, neighbors probably hate me, but that's delightful, isn't it? Oh man. All right, one more, just one more. Lovely. Just lovely. Okay, I hope you had fun. I'm gonna answer some Instagram questions now, and then we'll rank this sucker on the leaderboard, and I'll let you go. Dave and Bummers asks, are you able to keep it cool in traffic? The one I rode really didn't like idling in summertime traffic. Well, it's a pretty warm day today, and the temp gauge didn't really go above half or something, so I can't say I have a ton of experience with that. I'm sure there are some problems with them overheating, but I haven't had any problem. And I asked the owner, and I asked a bunch of people in my research for this article, everyone from old codgers that were journalists when this bike came out, to my friend who's owned one for 30 years, and that wasn't something that came up. So I don't know, hopefully that makes you feel better, answers your question a little bit. Guy Reynolds 49 says, fun fact, the 1985 RZ350 NC California model made 2 more horsepower than the 49 state version due to an improvement to California version of the catalyzed exhaust that year. I saved this comment because it's obviously not a question. This is a perfect example of how much more some people might know than I do about this bike. But that does bring up the fact also that the pipes were a real hot button on these bikes, right? Like lots of people swapped them out for different ones. They were usually louder. They usually made a little bit more horsepower because they weren't as choked by the catalyzers. So thanks for the info there, Guy Reynolds. Crack Moen asks, how practical would it really be to daily something like this in 2020? Maintenance, mileage, parts availability. I can't speak exactly to parts availability depending on where you live. I know that my buddy who's owned one for so long races his now, so he still races it in the summer, and he's able to keep it going. So I don't think he's dropping a fortune on parts, and he does crash it occasionally. But anyway, yeah, I think that, bikes like this they were designed to be street bikes. It's not like a 2-stroke supercross bike that you might remember from your youth or something like that had to get rebuilt all the time, and you're supposed to check all the things every 8 hours. Like, that's not the case with this bike. It's at its root pretty simple. There's not a lot of moving parts, right? It's just a crank and a piston basically flying around in there. So I think you could do it. Like I said before, I would ride it on Sundays and when I felt like I was in the mood. Reader 904 says, so you got mix oil and gas or separate places to fill? Okay. I got it. So the question is, do you have to premix the gas with oil? Because of course, two-strokes don't have crankcase oil. They use the oil mixed in with the gasoline to lubricate the bottom end and use it to explode and move the bike down the road. But no, the answer is you don't have to premix the gas. Under the seat, there's a little oil reservoir. It's got an oil injector. And so you just put pump gas in the tank. The oil injector mixes it for you and sends it into the engine. There are occasionally problems with that whereby the pump breaks and then the bike does not get oil mixed into the gas, and then it runs a little too hot and melts itself. But I haven't heard that being a huge problem. But yeah, based on the design that Yamaha did, you can actually accidentally not know that the oil pump is not operational. So that's a little tricky. Shanky Sammy asks, RZ350 or MT-03, which one would you choose? I mean, if I had to rely on, I don't know. Maybe I should ride an MT-03 and remind myself what that's like. Maybe I'll do that. Come to think of it, stay tuned. Anyway, the short answer is I would recommend someone get an MT-03 if you have to rely on it for transportation to get places. For me, I'd get this thing. How could you not? Ugh, look at it. You're riding around on history. It's just excellent from start to finish. I wouldn't be able to resist, but I would probably spend more time in the garage than someone who bought an MT-03. Last question, Adam Zalt asks, how do you like the analog feel of it compared to newer bikes? Good question, Adam Zalt. I feel like I remember that username. You've got good questions, Adam. I love the feel. I think it's just terrific. I think it connects me with an era of motorcycling that I otherwise wouldn't know about, or even if I did know about it, I wouldn't understand it because I've never felt it. So I love it. I think it's excellent. But you cannot deny that newer bikes are more confidence inspiring, whether it's because of the electronics like ABS and TC and that kind of thing, or it's just the layout, you know, the sort of like modern tires and wheel sizes and brake systems and suspension components. You know, it just, you feel more connected to the road on a new bike, and in general, you're probably just, you're gonna have a little bit more confidence. But for me, like, the feel of it is, it's super special. It's something that you know, it's locked in time, and you know, something like this is never gonna get made again, and that's why it's so cool. So anyway, let's go rank it on the leaderboard, and then I'll let you guys go.
All right, everybody, here we are back at Daily Rider headquarters. Now the fun part's over. We got some serious business to attend to. Ranking the RZ350 on the Daily Rider leaderboard. First things first, exciting day here at Daily Rider. First use of a blue pin. I know the bike's red and white, but you know, if you know motorcycles, blue for Yamaha. Makes sense, right? Where does it fall on the expense scale? I don't have a great idea of what $2,400 looked like in 1985. Wasn't really super into finance then, if I'm honest. But regardless, now, you know, 7-8 grand, I think, is approximately what you have to pay to get one of those bikes. And that's not a ton of money, realistically, for how kind of reasonable it is and how well it works, I don't think. So I think it's in the bottom half of the price scale, you know, a little cheaper than a Versus 650, so it'll be in this area. And then as far as, you know, dorky versus cool, I mean, yeah. It is a cool bike, right? It's a two-stroke. It's got Kenny Roberts' signature. Get out of here. Of course it's cool. It's unbelievably cool. Maybe not as advanced as a V4S Street Fighter. Maybe not as capable as an Africa Twin. But as far as kickstand presence, mwah. So I'm going to drop the pin here, cool, right about there, I think. Yamaha RZ350. Cool. Now the big kahuna. Where does it fall on the leaderboard? It's not as good as a Versus 650 or an Africa Twin. It's not as good as a Street Fighter, realistically. A Street Fighter, I know it's mostly has allure, but it also is a pretty reasonable bike aside from being a little warm on a warm day. You know, comfy seat, ABS, all that kind of stuff. Is it better than my 2006 KTM 950 Supermoto? I mean, an RZ350's got a bigger fuel tank, probably more range. It's got a lower seat height. My bike doesn't have ABS. RZ doesn't have ABS, but it's pretty close, right? It's pretty close. No, it's not. It's not as good. My bike is better as a daily rider. It's got electric start. It's got better brakes, even if it doesn't have ABS. I think realistically for a daily ride, aside from the seat height, my bike is pretty reasonable. So I did think there was gonna be a fun subtext, honestly, of Daily Rider about how my bike was always just gonna be the worst bike I'd ever ridden or ranked anyway. But very proud to say that it's not at the bottom of the list anymore. That is the RZ350, although on the cool scale, as we know, it would be right at the top. Anyhow, that was a fun trip into yesteryear. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun, of course, and I'll see you next time on Daily Rider.
Ah yes, famous stomping grounds of the RZ350, stuck in traffic between K-rails in a construction zone. That's what we're all about here on Daily Rider though, taking it for the daily ride.